Hello. Welcome everyone. So next we have Jeremy presenting on how Ubuntu and Debian GNOME work better together. Thank you.
Hi. Good afternoon. I have been having a wonderful time here at DebConf in Kosovo, and I hope you've been having a great week too. My name is Jeremy Bicha. I have been employed by Canonical since January. Canonical is the company behind Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is built using Debian, and Ubuntu developers contribute to Debian. I started using Linux in 2006 with Ubuntu 6.06. I really liked the idea of a free, useful operating system that I could use on my computer and anyone else around the world could use on their computers also, with a community that works together to make it better. In 2009, I finally found a bug that I knew how to fix when I was testing Ubuntu, an Ubuntu flavor at the time for education. I fixed the bug for Ubuntu and fixed it for Debian also. The Ubuntu release then was codenamed Karmic Koala. Now, in 2022, the current development release of Ubuntu is codenamed Kinetic Kudu. We reached the end of the alphabet and came all the way back to K again. GNOME was announced in 1997 and was quickly packaged for Debian. It used GTK+, a library that had been split out of the GNOME image manipulation program. That app is still available and still very popular. At the very beginning, there was a source package, GNOME Core and GNOME Libs. Many more packages were added later, and these source packages were split into more specific packages. In 1999, Mark Shuttleworth sold his tech startup company. He used the money from that to fund a variety of philanthropic efforts and famously took a ride aboard a Russian rocket to orbit the Earth. In 2004, he started a company built on Debian. Ubuntu was able to easily distinguish itself because of its predictable release schedule, opinionated defaults, a company that could provide contracted support, and of course a highly effective marketing campaign. Ubuntu used GNOME 2 as the default desktop. Mark hired several people that were packaging GNOME and Debian already, and they continued to push their work to Debian also. In 2010, in Brussels, Belgium, Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, announced that they would be offering a new desktop named Unity instead of the new GNOME Free release, which had not been released yet. In April 2011, GNOME 3.0 was released, and in the same month, Ubuntu 21.04 was released with Unity as the default desktop. Also, at the same time, I wanted to try out GNOME Free, but I couldn't because the packages didn't exist yet. They didn't exist because the GNOME release was too late to make it into the stable Ubuntu release, and work hadn't started on the next release yet. But there was a PPA available, a third-party apt archive, and the PPA was helpful because it had a lower barrier to entry. I didn't need to get formal Ubuntu upload rights since it was just an unofficial PPA with its own team. Later that year, our work was pushed to Ubuntu directly. At an Ubuntu Developer Summit I attended, one of the other Ubuntu developers suggested that I start an official flavor for GNOME so that people could use it directly without needing to install it on top of Ubuntu. So I co-founded Ubuntu GNOME with Tim Lunn, a Debian maintainer from Australia. Our first unofficial release was in 12.10, and our first official release was 13.04. At the time, I heard a lot of people claiming that you couldn't do proper GNOME development using Ubuntu because Ubuntu was just too different from GNOME, and you couldn't get a pure GNOME experience on Ubuntu. Because of that, I tried to make Ubuntu GNOME as pure as possible. So in the first unofficial release, it used Epiphany as the default web browser, which GNOME still recommends in its default set. However, I don't believe any distros will use that as the default. I also included ABoard and Numeric instead of LibreOffice. But in the next release, I switched away from these changes to go back to using Firefox and LibreOffice like most distros were using. And on the A board, I didn't notice at the time, but GNOME didn't have an official Office suite. Those were kind of unofficial apps alongside GNOME. So since even Fedora was shipping Firefox as the default browser, it seemed like using Epiphany wasn't really the best choice for our users at that point. We were also using an app called GNOME Package Kit to install apps. And that one, the user interface wasn't as great, so we switched that to Ubuntu Software Center also. In 2017, Canonical abruptly announced that it was ending development on Unity and ending its Ubuntu Phone project. Canonical laid off quite a few employees and stated that it was focusing on turning a profit for the first time in its history. Those changes worked. Canonical has been profitable since then. And then along with the announcement, it also meant that Ubuntu was going to be using GNOME again. However, the number of people in Canonical working on deb packaging directly for the Ubuntu desktop was low, and it was essential that they work together with Debian to share the workload. The discontinuation of Unity gave Canonical the opportunity to choose a completely different desktop. So some people may be wondering why they chose GNOME at that point. Even when Canonical was using Unity as a replacement for the GNOME shell, Ubuntu still included mostly GNOME apps. So it was still GNOME, it just looked different at first glance. Canonical's desktop team was most familiar with GNOME since they'd been using it since Ubuntu got started, which meant that they could fix bugs easier and handle integration between the different components better. GNOME offered a polished user experience with active development of new features, and existing features cover a wide variety of common, interesting use cases. And lastly, Ubuntu GNOME had done a good job of maintaining the GNOME on Ubuntu experience, so it was already there waiting for Ubuntu to switch back. Ubuntu 17.10 was the first release with GNOME Free as the default. It included two Ubuntu extensions, two GNOME shell extensions, a light fork of the popular dash-to-dock extension, which was named Ubuntu Dock, and the Ubuntu App Indicators extension. This was also a light fork, but later became maintained by Ubuntu directly. So the App Indicators extension allows for third-party apps to use little status icons in the top bar. Even though GNOME doesn't support that, it's still used by a lot of third-party apps, and so it's useful to enable those to keep working as their developers intended. One of the reasons for the forks was to ensure that users wouldn't get automatically updated to new versions of the extensions on stable Ubuntu releases. They later found an alternative way to keep the packages from being updated automatically. It also included Ubuntu's Adwaita and Radiance desktop themes. And window buttons were moved back to the right. In Unity, they were on the left. 3 window buttons were provided: minimize, maximize, and close. Upstream GNOME and Debian still only include the close button. My personal opinion is that Ubuntu doesn't need the maximize button, since you can easily maximize the app by, for instance, double-clicking on the app's title bar or dragging it to the top of the screen. But when you work on a team, you don't get everything that you want. So that was also more similar to what other operating systems use. So even getting rid of one of the buttons would have been maybe a little bit unusual for people. The minimize button makes sense because there's a dock right there. One of the reasons why the minimize button doesn't exist in upstream GNOME is because there is no dock. So you press the button and your app disappears, and it maybe confusing to know, well, how do I get that app back? Because it may look like it was closed. In later releases, we added one more default extension, Desktop Icons NG, for the next generation of that extension. It was added to keep desktop icon support. You can see a desktop icon here, but GNOME Core dropped that feature at a later point, so we were just keep enabling that feature. I don't use desktop icons really, but it's popular with a lot of people, so it's nice to keep that working. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we did together with Debian and Ubuntu GNOME, improving the packaging and other details. In late 2017, we switched GNOME packaging from using SVN to Git. This was a true team effort. While I did most of the final crossover, other people had written the migration scripts before. Debian GNOME was one of the last big teams to switch from SVN to Git. The migration was years in the making, but the final motivation came because the Alioth subversion, SVN hosting, was going to become read-only. So we were kind of forced into doing that if we wanted to be able to keep maintaining our packages. When we used SVN, we had a mono repository. By that I mean that every GNOME package was a separate folder in the single repository. We only included the Debian directories in that repository, and the full upstream source had to be fetched and kept elsewhere. But when we were using Git, we used git build package, and without git build package, our packaging workflow wouldn't be possible. So I thought it might be helpful to show what our git build package configuration looks like. First, we use pristine tar. I'm just checking to see if that's readable. Pristine tar avoids issues with package uploads getting rejected because regenerated upstream source tarballs have minor changes. We followed the DEP14 recommendations to use the Debian namespace for our Git branches on Debian. So the main branch of development is Debian/master, and we can easily use Debian/bullseye for stable release updates to the Debian bullseye release. Similarly, by using upstream/latest, we can use separate branches for an older series like upstream/3.38.x for Debian bullseye. Let me show you the difference here. So this one is for bullseye, and the .x is important because if you just used upstream/3.38, the way git build package works, that could be the name of a tag instead of a branch, the tag for the 3.38 release. So to avoid the conflict, that's what we call it. Going back to the previous slide. So the git build package workflow puts upstream in a separate branch. So that's why there's upstream there. But it's merged into the Debian branch. We plan later this year, likely, to change the Debian/master naming convention. I believe that name was recommended by DEP14 years ago, but now there's inclusive naming initiatives to use a name that's just better. So we probably call it Debian/latest to match the upstream/latest that we're already using. And that's what is recommended in DEP14 now also. It's a little bit awkward changing the Git branch names. Git just wasn't designed to do that cleanly, so people that have already checked out the Git branch have to do manual changes to make sure they're following the current master branch. We use Git build package's DCH tool to update the Debian changelog. The multi-mate merge option allows for commits to be grouped together for the same maintainer instead of just being listed in chronological order. So it just makes it a little bit easier to read when you have multiple people making changes on the same package. The DCH tool is really convenient because you don't need to edit the Debian changelog for every change you're making to the packaging. When it's time for you to release your changes to Debian, you can run gbp dch, and it fills in Debian changelog for you using the commit messages as the lines for the changes. In the import origin section, we use a custom command to automatically update Debian/changelog with the new version number. Otherwise, you'd have to do that step manually, and your package wouldn't build because Debian source format 3.0 quilt would notice that the upstream source changed, but it doesn't match the old version still on Debian/changelog. I don't know, that may be so useful that maybe Git build package should have a direct configuration to do that itself. We import the complete upstream Git history. This makes it easier to cherry pick specific commits using another Git build package tool called PQ, short for patch queue. It also allows seeing what things changed over time with the commit message that hopefully explains why. That's enabled with this upstream VCS tag line. So it links together which tag goes with the source tarball that the import origin tool is trying to use. This line is a little more complex than you may need because it's GNOME switched their version numbering system with GNOME 40 to use version numbers like 43.alpha for pre-releases. And we need to rewrite those to 43.alpha to make sure that they sort before the 43 stable release. And then the last line is telling the PQ tool to not add a number prefix to the file name for the patches. It just seemed to be more awkward with the numbers because later you could remove certain patches that are no longer needed, and then the version numbering it just didn't seem like it was helpful for us. Originally, we kept the Ubuntu specific packaging on git.launchpad.net. Since it was Ubuntu specific, it wasn't needed on the Debian side. But the workflow experience is pretty bad. You have to maintain a separate remote and push things to the right location. It's just complicated, and there's lots of opportunity for you not to end up pushing things that should have been. So we asked the Debian side of the Debian GNOME team if they would be okay with us pushing our Ubuntu branches directly to Salsa, and they agreed to that. This helps Debian by making it easier for Debian to cherry pick interesting changes from Ubuntu, and it further encourages Ubuntu to do their work in Salsa directly, and helps to reduce Ubuntu variants from Debian. Therefore, I recommend that all Debian package teams where Ubuntu is maintaining package differences to encourage Ubuntu to do the same thing, to use branches directly on Salsa instead of hosting them somewhere else. Dpackage has a cool feature to allow applying different patches on different distros. So instead of using the Debian/patches/series, you can have a Debian.series, you can have an Ubuntu.series, and have different patches listed in there. So I wasn't the first person to use this feature, but when I found it and thought it would be a useful way to allow Debian and Ubuntu packages to be in sync, it greatly disturbed some Debian developers. And so they ended up adding an entire paragraph in Debian policy. Hello? Hello? Are we good now? Mostly? Hello, can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me now? So they added an entire paragraph in Debian policy 4.5.1, paragraph 4.17, banning its use in Debian. So you can't use that feature anymore. I think it's a pretty cool achievement to get a Debian rule added because of something that you helped do. This doesn't mean that you can't have your packaging vary significantly on different distros. It's still possible to change configure flags, dependencies, and install files based on the distro where the package is built. You just can't do it with Debian patches. I think one of their concerns was the way the packages are unpacked. They didn't want that to be different based on what distro you were using to do the unpacking. So I did a count of our packages. It looks like we maintain approximately 279 packages on the team, and 84% of them are now in sync directly between Debian and Ubuntu, which is a pretty high number, really, considering how Ubuntu had diverged quite a bit over the years. I wanted to talk about, well, some of the examples of where there are differences. Ubuntu uses Launchpad to enable translation of packages and patches. Debian also has a translation ability, but it's awkward enough that we don't use it for GNOME packaging. So if we have a patch that's going to add new user-visible strings, user-visible text, we don't tend to push that into Debian because it makes the app not completely translated anymore. Ubuntu also includes some patches that have not been accepted upstream or configuration options that aren't the default yet. Some of these could be pushed into Debian, but it's just kind of like a judgment call whether it's helpful or not. When Canonical got started, they were a quite small company compared to the large number of people working on Debian directly. So they decided to split the archive. They have a section called main, which has the packages that they include by default and commit to supporting. And then everything else that they import from Debian is in a separate area called universe. That way, all of these other apps and features and packages are available, but it makes it more clear which ones Canonical will support for you and which ones won't. There's some dependencies that are not available in Ubuntu main, and so they have to be. So we have to tweak the dependencies. This can be done in Debian rules by checking for the distro and modifying the dependencies that way. And so we do that a lot of the time. So we don't need to maintain a difference, even though the end result is different. Kind of from the opposite perspective, there are dependencies or packages that are not in Debian. Honestly, a lot of times these packages ought to be pushed into Debian. Just no one has done it yet. I'm working on one right now. It's a DH, so Deb Helper extension to allow migrating user session changes because Debian doesn't offer that feature. So upstream makes changes sometimes, and we need the ability to change user-specific configuration. It's used for some interesting use cases to make transitions smoother. Upstream probably should write that transition feature into their software directly, but many times they don't. So this was available in Ubuntu like over a decade ago, but I'm like, hey, this could be useful for fixing some issues on Debian also, so I'm pushing it in now. When I filed my intent to package bug, there was a concern about
the package name. So I'm just making sure that everybody's happy with the package name first before doing that. So we're probably going to use a different name and then just migrate the Ubuntu packages that we're using the old name to use the new name. So when there's dependencies, if they involve different build depends, it's not possible to use that Debian rules workaround to modify build depends. There is an ugly hack you could use if you absolutely needed to have the package be exactly the same, the source packaging be the same. What you have to do is have a build depends on a package that only exists in Debian, and then have an alternate build depends on the package name that you actually want that exists on Ubuntu. And Ubuntu's build system respects those alternate build depends, so it works. But it's not very transparent what is going on there. And so, yeah, like I said, it's an ugly hack, so that's probably not really recommended. I've used it sometimes, but the better idea is to try to get these into Debian directly so that the Debian control file is more easily understandable. Sometimes the packaging has diverged way too much. The best examples I know of this are Firefox and Chromium. When they were still apt packages in Ubuntu, they used completely different build systems, and the packaging had diverged a very, very long time ago, and it would be an enormous amount of work to get those changes exactly the same. Again, because the build system is complex. If you want to look at the Debian rules file for those web browsers, it's very long and very complex. So there's also Ubuntu theming changes. Ubuntu has a certain look and feel that Debian doesn't have. Also, timing differences. There's release schedule skew where Debian freezes at different times and Ubuntu freezes at different times, and the other distro wants to keep developing. Similarly, on that last point, sometimes there's packaging transitions where we switch to updated libraries. Sometimes those are done in Debian first, sometimes they're done in Ubuntu first. And those new libraries may need packaging changes, so there's some temporary version differences at that point. Then there's also differences of opinion on what's best for our users. So with packaging, some of it's pretty straightforward, what choices you make. Other times, it's more judgment cases on trying to figure out which way we configure a package by default. And on these, Debian and Ubuntu sometimes have different philosophies. People also want to know that the Ubuntu customizations are nice, but maybe they don't want them. Maybe they just want regular GNOME. And you can get that quite easily by just installing the GNOME session package and then log out. On the login screen, then select your name, click the gear button in the bottom right, and choose GNOME as your session. So the Ubuntu session, which is done by default, is enabled by a GNOME shell mode. So the line A there is the main file where that configuration is kept. The GNOME shell modes are interesting to look at. They can enable certain extensions by default. They can turn on and off certain features. It's kind of a hidden feature that exists. It may be useful if you have any reason to want to have a customized GNOME environment for your workplace or for whatever users you maintain a system for. Similarly, you also need to add some GNOME session files so that this will show up as a login option on the screen. The GNOME shell mode also sets the environment variable, XDG current desktop, from GNOME to a prefix for the GNOME shell mode, and then GNOME. Once you have that set, then you also can get per session gsettings overrides. So gsettings is configuration for a lot of GNOME apps. They have extra settings stored in there. So we have we have overrides that are only used on the Ubuntu session, and they don't affect the other GNOME session, which is a really cool feature. You can also check for that environment variable to change behaviors of apps. So the example where we use this is in the GNOME settings app. We have a separate page in the latest development release. It's called Ubuntu Appearance, and it allows changing some options for our dock and other Ubuntu specific settings. And those are shown in the Ubuntu session, but not in the GNOME session. The GNOME session, it's a judgment call, but we figured that people want to run vanilla GNOME, so let's give them vanilla GNOME with only the GNOME options as much as possible. This GNOME shell mode is also used by GNOME Classic, so that would be the easiest way for you to look at it on your existing Debian system without looking at the Ubuntu files. So some of the benefits of Debian and Ubuntu GNOME working together are both Debian and Ubuntu will get new stable releases faster. If we weren't working together, Ubuntu would likely lag behind on GNOME releases, getting the new GNOME release 6 months later in the next Ubuntu version. Similarly, in Debian, it could lag months behind before the version gets packaged. But by working together, we can get these updates done much faster. We can have shared merge proposals, so it's visible. The changes are visible to Debian and Ubuntu, and it's all in one place, so you can view them easier that way. We get more bug reports. We get bug reports from Debian users. We get bug reports from Ubuntu users. And then we can fix them and benefit everyone that uses Debian and Debian derivatives. By having people from different backgrounds working together, it allows us to have different technical expertise to solve more difficult packaging problems and more difficult bugs. And then it also helps on transitions because we could push the transition through on Ubuntu first, giving us useful data and figuring out how to get it done to do it more smoothly on Debian. Lastly, I want to talk about things that we still could use help on. So kind of talking about the future. So some people believe that the purpose of Debian development processes is to build Debian stable. But I believe in reality that many developers are only focused on Debian unstable or testing. And I think that's okay, but someone needs to do that work for Debian stable also. Currently, there's very little work being done on pushing GNOME bug fixes into Debian stable. Our Debian project leader, Jonathan, has asked for a volunteer to run the Debian 12 artwork contest. Please talk with him if that's something that you would like to coordinate. It should be started soon so that it's complete and integrated without needing to rush late in the release cycle. There's also other changes that could be made. We're not required to ship GNOME vanilla exactly as GNOME provided it. Maybe we should tweak things that would be better for our users. I personally use Ubuntu, and sometimes it's difficult to try to figure out what's best for Debian users since it's different than what I'm using. So help could be used there. We also could use help on bug triage. There's a lot of bugs in the Debian bug tracker, and someone needs to go through them and probably close ancient ones if they don't clearly apply to new releases anymore. Also, a lot of apps around GNOME are built in Rust, and Rust packaging is a lot more difficult for our team because we don't have as much expertise in Rust. This one is also hard because the Rust libraries need to be packaged first for Debian best practices instead of vendoring them. So this one's actually kind of a challenging one for someone new to Debian development to work on. We are making some progress on that now. It's just a very complicated ecosystem, and the Debian Rust team is also complicated in how they do their packaging. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to open it up for any questions.
So you mentioned the user experience tweaks. I'm wondering if you could shed some light on what you think user experience tweaks should be made by a distro like Debian or Ubuntu, or what is rather in the realm of the desktop environment.
Well, I mean, Debian could enable some extensions by default, possibly. The dock is a very popular extension. Actually, probably a better example are the desktop icons. That is something that every other desktop provides by default, and so maybe that's something that could be enabled by default in a custom Debian session. So there's some interesting choices like that I have hesitated from making up to this point, but maybe they should be discussed, and maybe some of those changes should be made.
Any other question? Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you.
I have one more thing. So I have one more talk this week scheduled for Saturday at the moment, and it's talking about it's a short talk, so shorter than this one, just showing off some of what has changed in GNOME since the last stable release, coming up on the new stable release for Debian next year. Maybe one more question, since we do have a little bit of time.
So it's a silly question, but we have time. So
Yes.
I saw you many times ranked on the top uploaders in Debian. This time you only uploaded 238 times this year. Your activity has slowed down, or is it because you've done a lot of things before?
I was having trouble hearing part of that. Can you rephrase that?
Okay, there's a page that ranks uploaders in Debian and how many uploads it did over the year. You used to be on the top 3 or 5 many years.
Oh, okay.
This year you're 24 with 238 uploads only, which is still a lot, but so your activity has slowed down because everything is already job done, or?
Yeah, it's probably that the work is done. That the latest GNOME version is already in Debian. I'm surprised I haven't seen that page, or at least not in a while. So I didn't know what my ranking was on there. It also is an indication that there's a lot of people working on Debian, and so there's big ecosystems like Perl and Rust where someone can have quite high upload numbers. I don't think I've slowed down. But thank you.
Hello. Currently, which are the biggest challenges regarding to the GNOME work and the share responsibility between Debian and Ubuntu to have nice GNOME development?
I think the biggest challenge from the Ubuntu side is that we have some design ideas that we would like to push into GNOME, and this is kind of awkward saying, but there's a little bit of anti-Ubuntu sentiment in the GNOME project, to where it just takes a bit more work for us to get our changes in. Also, GNOME design processes are very complex. They take a lot of time making decisions to try to make them as perfect as possible. So it's kind of like it's like a higher standard of review, maybe similar to like the Linux kernel. For many of the modules, you have to do things exactly a certain way. And it's taking that concept and applying it to design instead of strictly to code. But we have been working with them, and it's also something where the more you contribute, the more of a voice you have, since you're doing a lot of the work and have more say on the vote there. I think you had a second part to your question where you're asking about more on the Debian side. And I talked a little bit about things that we still could use work on. And I think the biggest one historically had been hesitating on the Ubuntu side for making Debian-specific changes. But once again, on the Debian side, Debian maintainers of packages have a lot of authority over their packages to decide what they want their package to do. And as long as they're not doing something that's way out of line, they have that freedom. So if I'm maintaining the package, then I probably should take the responsibility to make the decisions instead of hoping someone from the Debian side will come around and make that decision. That's the responsibility of the maintainer too. So that's something that I'm thinking about going forward. Thank you.
We have one more question.
Not so much a question, I just wanted to say thank you because I rely on your packages for everyday use and they usually work very well, so thank you.
Thank you.